The speakers came on at 2 in the morning. Not every night, that would have been predictable, and predictable could be prepared for, could be slept through, could be managed. The speakers came on when Jones decided they would come on, which meant they could come on at 2 in the morning or at 3 or at midnight or at 4:30, an hour before the workday began, when the body was deepest in sleep and the mind was least defended. A woman who lived in Jonestown for 14 months and survived described it this way: "You never fully went to sleep. Even when you were asleep, some part of you was listening, waiting, because the moment you stopped listening was usually the moment the speakers came on. And if you weren't awake when the speakers came on, someone would wake you. And being found asleep when the community was being called together was not something you wanted to be found doing." The technical term for what Jim Jones did to 900 people in the jungles of Guyana is sleep deprivation. The clinical literature on sleep deprivation describes it with the precision that clinical literature brings to everything: cognitive impairment beginning after 24 hours of wakefulness, judgment degradation measurable after 36, hallucination possible after 72, the erosion of the capacity to evaluate information critically, to weigh consequences, to distinguish threat from safety, to hold on to the self that existed before the deprivation began. What the clinical literature does not describe, what it cannot describe because it was not designed to describe it, is what it feels like to be inside a system that uses your exhaustion as a tool. That has been engineered, with patience and precision and a decades-long understanding of how human beings break, to keep you just tired enough that the voice coming through the speakers at 2 in the morning sounds, in ways it would not sound to a rested mind, like the only voice in the world that knows what is real. If you have ever wondered how 900 people in a jungle in Guyana arrived at the same place at the same time, subscribe right now and hit the bell, because the answer did not begin with poison. It began with the night, with the speakers, with the slow, systematic dismantling of the one resource that every human being requires to remain themselves. Go back to the beginning of the night broadcasts. Go back to 1974, 4 years before Jonestown, when People's Temple was still in California and the broadcasts had not yet achieved the frequency or the intensity they would reach in Guyana but were already a presence in the lives of senior members. Jones called them meetings. They happened late after 10, sometimes after midnight, and attendance was not optional. The stated purpose varied. Sometimes it was a security concern that required immediate community response. Sometimes it was a theological matter that Jones had been wrestling with and needed to share. Sometimes it was discipline: a member had violated community rules and needed to account for it in front of the congregation, and the accounting happened at whatever hour Jones decided it should happen. The commonality was the hour. The lateness was never incidental. Jones understood, with the intuitive precision of someone who had been reading crowds for 20 years, that a person encountered at midnight is a different person from the one encountered at noon. The defenses are lower. The critical faculty is slower. The emotional responses are closer to the surface. A congregation gathered at midnight in a room they cannot leave, addressed by a voice they have been trained to trust, is a congregation that is available in ways that a well-rested congregation is not. By the time the community moved to Jonestown in 1977, the late-night assemblies had become something more systematic. The settlement had a public address system. Speakers mounted on poles throughout the compound that could reach every cabin, every building, every corner of the cleared jungle. Jones could address the entire community from a central location at any hour. And he did. Survivors who were in Jonestown from its earliest days described the progression clearly. In the first months, the broadcasts were infrequent enough to be surprising. By the middle period, they were regular enough to be anticipated. By the final months, they were constant enough that the absence of a broadcast felt wrong, felt like a held breath, a suspension before something worse. The community had been trained, without being told it was being trained, to organize its anxiety around the speakers. The speakers had become the signal that Jones was present, that the community was intact, that the threat, always approaching, always just outside the perimeter, had not yet arrived. The silence between broadcasts was not peace, it was waiting. What Jones said during the broadcasts varied in content and was consistent in structure. He began with the threat. The threat changed in its specific form. Sometimes it was the CIA, sometimes the FBI, sometimes the Guyanese government, sometimes unnamed enemies in the United States who were working to destroy the community and return its members to the racism and exploitation they had fled. The specifics were less important than the emotional architecture. Jones needed the threat to be credible enough to produce fear and vague enough that it could not be evaluated against evidence. A specific threat can be investigated, can be confirmed or denied, can be shown to be false. A general threat, enemies, forces, powers aligned against the community, cannot be falsified. It requires only that the listener be tired enough, frightened enough, isolated enough that the alternative hypothesis, that there is no threat, that the threat is a story Jones is telling, feels more dangerous than the threat itself. By 2 in the morning, after months of interrupted sleep, the alternative hypothesis was very hard to hold. After the threat came the community. Jones was extraordinarily skilled at this transition, from the fear of what was outside the compound to the warmth of what was inside it, from the darkness beyond the perimeter to the light of what they had built together. The people around you, he would say, are the only people who truly know you. The world you left behind, the racism, the exploitation, the loneliness of living in a society that did not see you, that world is still out there. These people, here, in this place, at this hour, they are all you have. They have given everything for this. You have given everything for this. What you have built together is worth protecting, worth dying for, if it came to that. And then, having said the word dying, having introduced it casually into the warmth of the community language, he would move on. He would not linger on it. He would not explain it. He would let it sit, like something dropped into water, and watch the circles spread. A psychiatrist who studied the Jonestown survivors extensively in the years following the massacre described the night broadcasts in terms that no survivor had used but that every survivor, when they heard the description, confirmed as accurate. She said Jones had constructed what she called a closed emotional loop. Fear produced by the external threat could only be resolved by the internal community. The internal community could only be accessed through Jones. Jones controlled access to both the fear and the resolution. A person inside that loop had no external reference point from which to evaluate whether the fear was real, because every moment they might have used for that evaluation, every quiet hour, every rested morning, every conversation outside the group had been systematically eliminated. The night broadcasts were not separate from this system. They were its primary mechanism. They kept the loop closed. They kept the external world at a distance. They kept the community, at every hour of the night, inside the architecture Jones had built for it. The sleep deprivation had physical consequences that survivors describe in detail and that medical literature on the subject confirms precisely. The body's stress response, maintained at elevated levels for months, produces cortisol in quantities that damage the hippocampus, the region of the brain most responsible for forming and retrieving memories, for distinguishing past from present, for maintaining the continuous sense of self that allows a person to evaluate their current situation against their history. People in Jonestown, by the final months, were not the people who had arrived, not because Jones had replaced them with something else, because the resource required to maintain themselves, sleep, rest, the nightly consolidation of experience into memory that gives a person their continuous identity had been taken from them so gradually and so systematically that they had not noticed it going. They were exhausted in a way that exhaustion does not adequately describe. They were, in the clinical sense, cognitively compromised. Their capacity to evaluate Jones's claims, to weigh what they were being told against what they knew, to ask the question that healthy cognition makes possible, is this true, had been eroded the way a shoreline erodes, grain by grain, over months, until the land that was there is simply gone and the water comes in. Survivors describe the final months in Jonestown with a consistency that researchers find remarkable. They describe a quality of unreality, a sense of watching themselves from a distance, a difficulty distinguishing what they thought from what they had been told to think, a loss of the internal voice that, in ordinary circumstances, provides running commentary on experience, the voice that says this seems wrong, or I don't understand this, or something is not right here. That voice requires rest to function. It requires the nightly recalibration that sleep provides. Jones had taken the rest. He had taken the recalibration. And in their absence, the only voice available was the one coming through the speakers. The final white night, the night of November 18, 1978, when the cups were not empty and the order was not a rehearsal, was preceded by weeks in which the broadcasts had become almost continuous. Survivors who were there in those final weeks described sleeping in shifts of 2 and 3 hours, being woken by the speakers, assembling in the pavilion, listening, returning to their cabins, lying down, being woken again. The cumulative sleep debt by that point was, in the assessment of the psychiatrist who studied the survivors, severe enough to produce in most residents a state of cognitive function that she compared to moderate intoxication. Not enough to prevent comprehension, enough to prevent the kind of critical evaluation that might have produced resistance, enough to make the voice in the speakers the most coherent thing in a world that had become, through months of managed exhaustion, very hard to read. Jones knew what he was doing. This is not speculation, it is the conclusion of every serious researcher who has examined the night broadcast records, the survivor testimony, and the psychiatric literature on sleep deprivation as a tool of coercive control. He had read about it. He had studied the techniques used in military interrogation and political imprisonment and cultic control, and he had adapted them with the patience and precision of someone who was building something meant to last. The night broadcasts were not a symptom of his paranoia. they were a tool of his control. The paranoia was real. By the final years in Guyana, Jones's drug use and isolation had produced a genuine paranoid disorder that was distinct from his strategic use of fear as a management mechanism. But the night broadcasts preceded the paranoia. They were designed before the disorder. They were, at their origin, a choice. That is the thing about Jonestown that the night broadcasts make undeniable. The suffering was not incidental. It was not the unintended consequence of a flawed utopia. The exhaustion, the fear, the closed loop, the systematic removal of the cognitive resources required to resist, these were not failures of the project. They were the project. Jones built Jonestown to produce exactly what it produced. A community of people who were too tired to leave, too frightened to question, too isolated to remember who they had been before the speakers came on in the middle of the night and the voice filled the darkness and the threat was always approaching and the only safety was here, together, inside, with him. He built it carefully and he built it over years and he built it out of the nights he took from 900 people one interrupted hour at a time. The weapon was the darkness. The ammunition was exhaustion. And by the time the cups were filled, the battle had already been won. In the small hours of 100 nights that no one outside the compound had seen, in the silence between broadcasts when 900 people lay in their cabins and listened, even in their sleep, for the sound of the speakers coming on. There is a detail in the survivor testimony that appears in multiple accounts. In the weeks before the massacre, several residents began keeping private tallies, not of the broadcasts, the number per night, the duration, the hour, but of the silences. The periods between broadcasts when the speakers were off and the jungle was audible, insects, birds, the acoustic texture of equatorial night. These residents, without coordinating with each other, had started counting the minutes of silence, writing them down in the margins of whatever paper was available, as if silence were a resource being rationed. One survivor kept her tally on the inside cover of a notebook she had brought from California. The tally ran for 6 weeks. In the final 2 weeks, the silences had become so short, 40 minutes, 30, sometimes less, that several entries are simply a dash. Not enough silence to count. Not enough to rest inside. Not enough to remember who she had been before the speakers started. She survived because she was outside the compound on November 18th, accompanying a sick child to a medical facility in Port Kaituma. She came back 2 days later. She has spoken about that return only twice, in 2 separate interviews separated by 20 years. And both times she said the same thing. She said she did not hear the silence until she was standing in the empty compound. She said it was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Louder than the broadcasts. Louder than anything Jones had ever put through the speakers. The silence of 900 people who were no longer there to make noise. She said, I had spent months counting the minutes of silence, trying to save them up, trying to remember what quiet felt like. And then I had all of it at once, more quiet than I had ever wanted. And it was the worst thing I have ever experienced, because that silence was made of them. It was made of everyone who wasn't there to make noise anymore. And I have never been able to hear quiet the same way since. Quiet sounds like Jonestown to me now. Quiet sounds like the speakers that aren't coming on. The psychiatrist who studied the survivors wrote, in the conclusion of her clinical report, something that has been cited more often than anything else in her academic work. She wrote, the most durable damage of systematic sleep deprivation is not cognitive. It is not the memory impairment, not the judgment degradation, not the susceptibility to suggestion, though all of those are real and documented and serious. The most durable damage is to the self's relationship with its own perception. A person who has been kept at the edge of sleep for months, who has learned to distrust their own evaluations, to defer to the voice that knows better, to exist in a permanent state of managed uncertainty about what is real. That person, even after adequate sleep is restored, even after the cognitive impairment resolves, carries something that does not resolve. A hesitation at the moment of evaluation. A habit of doubt directed inward rather than outward. A tendency, when faced with something that seems wrong, to ask not is this wrong but am I seeing this correctly? Jones gave his congregation that doubt. He built it into them one interrupted night at a time. And the survivors carry it still. Not as a belief, as a reflex. The reflex of a mind that learned, in the dark, in Jonestown, that its own perceptions could not be trusted, that the voice through the speakers knew better, that the self was the least reliable witness to its own experience. That is what the night broadcasts produced. That is what the weapon was actually for. The speakers are gone now. The compound was reclaimed by the jungle years ago. The poles are rusted, the wires are buried, the mechanism that allowed one man's voice to fill 900 people's nights has long since dissolved into the rainforest. But the broadcasts themselves are preserved. They are in the archives. Researchers have listened to them. The full recordings, the ones that ran for 2 and 3 hours in the middle of the night, the ones where Jones's voice moves from threat to warmth to threat again with the practiced fluency of someone who has done this so many times that the transitions are automatic. The researchers describe listening to them as deeply uncomfortable even in daylight, even rested, even knowing what they know about what happened. They describe the voice as having a quality that is difficult to explain to someone who has not heard it. Not simply persuasive, not simply frightening, something that operates below the level of argument, below the level of evaluation, that addresses something in the listener that does not require content to respond, that responds to the voice itself, to the fact of it, filling the dark, patient and certain and absolutely present in a way that daylight and rest and safety make it possible to resist, and that 2 in the morning after 6 weeks of interrupted sleep makes almost impossible to refuse. Almost. One researcher who spent years with the recordings said, "I understand, after listening to them, why people stayed. I do not mean that as a condemnation of the people who stayed. I mean it as the most frightening thing I know about human beings, that this is available to us, that a voice, in the dark, at the right hour, with the right history behind it, can do this, that we are this available. All of us. At 2 in the morning, in the dark, exhausted, afraid. All of us.